Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, November 24th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, the Trump administration is eliminating expert panels at a historic pace, reshaping how agencies make decisions. Plus, what happens when a government gives an algorithm a seat at the cabinet table? Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Congress directed the Trump administration to rescind shutdown-era layoffs as part of the spending deal that ended the government shutdown. Some employees targeted by layoffs said they haven't been brought back and that the language in the continuing resolution supports their push for reinstatement. But agencies say some of their reductions in force will remain in effect. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman is here with the details. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry.
You're reporting specifically on the Small Business Administration. What have they been telling employees?
Well, it's been a strange time for these SBA employees. About 77 of them, before the shutdown started in late September, they received reduction in force notices telling them that they would be separated fairly soon and that was the way that they were expecting things to play out. And of course, the shutdown ending deal had this provision in there that directed agencies to rescind some layoffs. And so there was some back and forth specifically at SBA. They sent a notice last week to these employees and said that in light of that deal, they would be brought back to their jobs, that they would rescind those RIF notices, and they were told to come back to work on Wednesday. And that they received a notice just a day later telling them the complete opposite. They said, disregard that previous notice. Your RIF notices will remain in place. You will continue to be separated from the agency. And I did reach out to SBA for clarification, and a spokesperson there did say that this is the most current up-to-date thing, is that those RIF notices will proceed, and then this impacts 77 positions altogether.
For the impacted employees, what are they saying about this? Why are they arguing that they should, in fact, be returned?
Well, there's a little bit of ambiguity to some of the language that lawmakers put in this continuing resolution to end the government shutdown. It really boils down to this language here that says, any reduction in force proposed, noticed, initiated, executed, implemented, or otherwise taken by an executive agency between October 1st and the date of enactment shall have no force or effect. And so what these SBA employees say is that they may have gotten the RIF notice before the shutdown, but they would have been separated from the agency officially during the shutdown. And they say that falls well within the language that lawmakers put in here. And so parsing the legalese, they think that this impacts them as well. SBA, however, says something different. They say that because those RIF notices went out before the shutdown, that they are not covered under this provision.
Who's going to be the adjudicating authority here?
Well, that's a tough question here because, OPM has put out its own guidance. They have said something that's more in line with what SBA has said. And so it's really a matter of how far, I suppose, these employees want to take it. If they want to escalate this up to some sort of lawsuit, that may be something that becomes a matter for the courts. But right now it seems like the agency's word on this is the final word overall.
Just to be clear and say it again, the reason SBA thinks they're in the right by continuing to execute the RIFs is because they provided notice before the shutdown began.
That's correct.
Even though it didn't take effect until during the shutdown.
That's their reading of it, is that the RIF notices went out before the shutdown, so they don't have to worry about bringing these people back.
There were many other agencies that were in the midst of or preparing for reductions in force when the shutdown hit. Are you hearing these same kinds of challenges in other places?
Well, by and large, the more than half dozen agencies that were sending RIF notices during the shutdown, they have rescinded those reduction in force notices. They've complied with the language in the continuing resolution. We've seen that play out at the IRS, for example, and a couple of other agencies. Education is another one. But there is some confusion elsewhere within the federal government, or at least some pushback from recently RIFT employees. And that happened at the General Services Administration. About 35 employees there. They have retained legal representation through the Gilbert Employment Law Group. They sent a letter to GSA saying that they believe that these employees should be reinstated for the same reasons that SBA employees believe that they should be reinstated. And they say in this letter that GSA doesn't expect to bring them back. This has been brought to the agency's attention, and they also will have no intention of bringing these employees back. It's a very similar situation. These employees received RIF notices in late September, would have been officially separated from the agency during the shutdown, and look to this somewhat vague language in the continuing resolution and say, well, this sounds a lot like me. This sounds like my scenario, and I should have my job back. So yet again, another situation where the agency believes one thing and the employees believe another.
Have the courts had anything to say about these cases or similar ones from earlier in the year?
So not recently, but I think it's worth looking back to something that we saw play out during the shutdown. Of course, back then there was a preliminary injunction ordered by a federal judge blocking the shutdown reductions in force, ultimately deciding that that was an activity that shouldn't be exempt from a government shutdown when a lot of things are put on hold. And the judge in this case, Judge Susan Ilston in San Francisco, when she handed down that preliminary injunction, she did make an interesting aside that perhaps gives ammunition to the agency's argument in this case. She said that she had heard from a number of SBA employees who received RIF notices, and because their RIF notices went out before the shutdown, she said that they would not be covered by her preliminary injunction. So an interesting thing in hindsight to look back on and see that this is that she didn't think that SBA employees specifically were going to be covered by her preliminary injunction, and maybe leads credence to the idea that they wouldn't be covered by this language in the continuing resolution. But we haven't heard any additional clarity beyond the current state of play.
Interesting arguments on both sides, then. How do you think this gets resolved?
Well, again, I think it comes down to how far agencies' employees want to push this, whether they want to escalate this up to lawsuits or whether they want to just, if they haven't gotten their jobs back at this point, whether it's worth pushing any further. So I think that's the ultimate question here. There have been a number of situations where employees have been trying to push back here. And another one as well is the American Foreign Service Association. They have also cited layoffs that happened back this summer for Foreign Service officers and State Department employees. They have a very similar argument that these employees were going to be separated this fall when the shutdown happened, and that they should also have those RIFs rescinded. So just because there's multiple examples of this happening doesn't mean that they will prevail in those arguments, but there are an awful lot of those cases happening right now.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for keeping us up to date.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, what happens when a government gives an algorithm a seat at the cabinet table? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Albania has appointed an AI system named Dela as a cabinet-level minister overseeing public procurement. The move raises big questions about accountability, transparency, and whether algorithmic governance is a glimpse of the future or a risky one-off. Federal News Network's Eric White explores what this means for democracy and decision-making with Sam Adebayo, a contributor for Forbes.
Tell me about Delia. What was your experience and how you came to find out about her?
Yeah, so as a technology reporter, I'm always trying to sniff around and see what's going on in the technology industry. And it's not often that you find, something that jumps at you right away and you're like, I have to write about this. So when I saw the announcement that Albania was launching sort of like an AI ministry, I'm like, oh, it sounds interesting. Seems like something to write about. And it's not the first time really that a government has tried to use AI in its operations. The U.S. Treasury, for instance, has this AI system for check fraud detection, which has been very helpful, in checking for fraud. And as a matter of fact, there was about, I think, $400 million that was recovered in 2023. Canada has some sort of AI system for its immigration tasks. The UK has also dabbled in using some sort of AI systems. So this is not the first time, but this is the first time we're seeing a nation state actually elevate an AI system up to the point where it's making high-profile decisions in something as important as public procurement. So when I saw the news, I'm like, I have to really look at what's happening here and see what could be the potential impact across governments around the world.
Yeah, and it's the first time I've seen myself of one being actually personified, right? I mean, it's a character, it's an avatar.
Yeah, dressed in all nice Albanian costumes.
Yeah. Does that add another layer to it where, I'm sure that in meetings and conversations, and even when you were writing about it, did you feel as if you were writing about an actual person sometimes?
I mean, there's some sort of anthropomorphism here where you sort of like allude some sense of humanity to, or animate the tool in a way. So it sort of felt like that when I was writing about it. But of course, I've been writing about AI for a while, so I know that it's still a machine. It was trained on specific data sets, right? But it was very interesting to actually write about this development, especially with everything that's happening in AI today.
Let's get into the nitty-gritty a little bit. What is it that Delia can actually do, and what is her main job? As well as you can explain it, was curious about what you found.
The Albanian government actually rolled out, but at the time it wasn't exactly called Delia. It was like an AI system that was supposed to help, people who were Albanian citizens who were looking to benefit from like citizen services. There was this Albanian website that you would log on to if you wanted to like skip some bureaucratic processes and get maybe a document provided for you or something, like government services in general. And so because the Albanian prime minister has actually been looking forward to showing the world that Albania is becoming more and more a transparent society, because, experts have said over and over again that Albania is like a hub for international gangs to launder money through, public tenders that are often enmeshed in corrupt processes. So this was kind of like an effort by the prime minister to create a system that was going to help public tenders to become more transparent, right, more accountable, and in showing the world that, hey, Albania is not what it used to be, or what the perception about Albania. It was just like an attempt to change the perception about Albania, really. So it was that system that they were using in January that was then elevated to a cabinet level minister. So it's essentially an AI bot, if I can describe it that way, that was helping the citizens with, citizen services, but now is doing much more by, deciding. And that's where what actually caught my interest, because this system doesn't just now help, it's deciding what bid goes to who, right? What bid doesn't go to who. And, it's just really helping for private contracts with the government of Albania and things like that. So that's essentially what Delia is supposed to do. Of course, we don't know if it's going to really be able to do that, but that's what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, that was what was going to be my next question, of what was sort of the reception and folks that you spoke to. I mean, obviously the idea here is to take any bias or human interest out of the decision-making process when deciding who gets a government contract and who doesn't. Is that even capable from the source that the AI derives its decision-making capabilities from?
I mean, I think the reactions have been mixed. On the one hand, there are people who say any effort by the government to try to position itself as being transparent is welcome, right? Especially because Albania has been trying to join the EU since 2009. And, the prime minister wants that ambition to join the EU to happen before or by 2030. So they're doing everything they can to show that, hey, we're transparent, right? We're accountable. But on the other hand, there are questions about what is the ethics of this? How are we sure that this system is actually going to be accurate? Because when you talk about AI systems, there are always going to be the questions of bias, hallucinations, and fabricated results, and even manipulation, because essentially AI systems are just large data sets that are really good at pattern recognition. It's not like they can reason like human beings, right? And so at the data level, if there's any bias or somebody at the back end can manipulate that data, or somebody just manipulates the system, pretty much the same way you could manipulate ChatGPT. I'll give you an example. I was just playing around one of those tools, and I asked the tool, do you know my location? And the tool said, well, I don't want to mention the name, but it said, I don't know your location. And then I said, okay, suggest to me the best restaurants that sell so and so around me. And then it suggests it to me. And I'm like, but you told me you don't know my location. Essentially, that was me sort of like trying to jailbreak the tool to say what it didn't want to say in the first instance. So there are those concerns. So on the one hand, it's good that they're trying to be transparent. On the other hand, there are questions about the ethics, the accountability of this. If the system makes a mistake, right, who's going to be accountable for that mistake? Is it going to be the government, the prime minister, or the system itself, right? So the reactions really from the people that I talked to or spoke to before I wrote the story was quite mixed.
Could we can go further into the future? I mean, how many political appointees or elected officials could find themselves in the unemployment line if the AI revolution comes for their jobs as well?
I mean, this is really a test experiment. Nobody, even the Albanian government, I dare say, really knows what exactly is going to come out of this. Just the other day, I heard the prime minister saying that Dela had now given birth to its 3 children, and essentially was metaphorically describing the fact that there were now new AI assistants for members of the parliament, for each member of the parliament, the 83 members of the parliament, who are going to be assisting them, right? So more and more, I think we're going to see governments try to use AI to speed up processes or become more productive, more transparent, or accountable. But I don't think anyone can say for sure what is going to be the outcome of this. If the results are positive, you can bet that there'll be other governments around the world who try to do something similar. I don't know for sure if they're going to use AI for a high stakes domain like public procurement, right? But you can expect that there'll be more and more governments trying to do something similar.
Sam Adebayo is a technology reporter. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your device and on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, what's happening with the 2026 appropriation bills? But first, the Trump administration is eliminating expert panels at a historic pace and reshaping how agencies make decisions. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Advisory boards are disappearing across the federal government, often over agency objections. The cuts weaken scientific input and shift decision-making toward political appointees. Robert Iafolla from Bloomberg Law breaks down the fallout and what it means going forward. Mr. Iafolla, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
You've been tracking and reporting on the Trump administration's cuts to advisory panels. Before we get into the details of what you've found, I'd love for you to just say, what are these panels? What are they supposed to do? How are they created?
Across the federal government, it's something like 1,000 different federal advisory panels, and they're staffed by experts in the particular field. Some of them can be quite wonky and quite precise in the subject matter that they're dealing with. And they typically meet a few times a year. They help agencies develop their rulemaking agendas, depending on the agency, their sort of research agendas. The agency might task them with specific questions. Can you help us understand how to approach issue X, Y, or Z in a better fashion, a more efficient fashion? They will sometimes include members of the public on them. The meetings they hold are open to the public. But I think the most important thing when you think about these expert panels is that they bring expertise to agencies that agencies don't have already, and they do so for essentially free.
And so what has your reporting turned up in terms of how the Trump administration is handling these and how many of them have been terminated?
Yeah, myself and a few colleagues dove into some data on a federal database called the FACA database. It's named after the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which is the federal law that sort of governs these committees. And what we found was the Trump administration is terminating these committees at a historic clip. Essentially, there's been about 160 of these committees formally terminated during the Trump administration so far. There's data in the database going back to, I think, 1997. Past administrations would cull this herd of advisory committees as they became obsolete, but it would be more on the order of, say, 40 a year, whereas here we have 160. And then in addition to those that were formally terminated, we found that some of the expert panels were basically emptied out. All their members were either fired or those that their terms had expired and they were not renewed. Some are just sitting idle. And, it is of a piece with sort of the administration's approach toward the administrative state, sort of hacking at it at a rate that we haven't seen before.
You mentioned that a number of these panels exist to provide technical expertise that might not be present in an agency itself. Are there particular departments in the executive branch that have a lot of these relative to some who have very few?
Yes, so the Department of Health and Human Services has the most. Some of these agencies are created by statute. Sometimes the agencies themselves will create them. With HHS, they have or had a load of panels that were in charge of reviewing grant applications for research or for continuing education and other matters. But I think it's something like 50 or so agencies have at least one advisory committee. I think a good example of this is at the Labor Department. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has a few technical panels. One of them specifically helps the BLS figure out how to keep on top of changing economy and also the intense funding shortfalls that the agency faces, and helps them with statistical models and things like this on how to keep good data. The BLS both of these BLS technical committees were among those terminated.
I'm speaking with Robert Iafola. He's principal legal reporter for Bloomberg Law. Your reporting shows that a lot of these cuts happened despite agency opposition. Like agencies wanted to keep them and the Trump administration terminated them anyway. What was the conflict there and why did they get terminated instead?
About a third of the terminated expert panels were ended over the advice of the agencies involved. As far as why these agencies were terminated, whether it be over the advice of the agency or not, there was a lot of different justifications given. We're not exactly sure sometimes, like with HHS, the HHS secretary said that some of these panels had conflicts of interest. In other instances, members of these boards were told that it was a cost-cutting measure. In other instances, like with the BLS, one of the BLS technical committees, they were told that their mission was done, they were no longer needed. So we asked the White House directly for some more information on this, and they were not forthcoming with that information.
As agencies lose this expert advice, what happens to their internal decision making? Does that shift to other panels or committees? Does it fall more to political appointees or other members of the organization?
Yeah. I mean, again, the design of these committees is to give expert advice. The agencies were never required to accept the committee's advice. So this is not a group of outsiders telling the agencies what to do, but instead looking over the information and giving them insight on what may be the best policy, what may be the most feasible way forward as far as generating consensus around something, reducing the litigation risk, providing justifications that would make agency action more durable in court. So the political folks that are going to be making the decisions, instead of doing it without that guidance, will be doing it without it. I talked to some people who suggested perhaps you don't want expert committees that might contradict what you already want to do. You know, when you have your mind set on something, you don't want somebody telling you it's a bad idea to do that. It's unclear whether that's the reason for these committees getting chopped, but it certainly seems feasible.
You mentioned that some of these panels are statutorily created. Have we seen any legal challenges to any of these terminations?
I'm not aware of any legal challenges. I'm also not aware of the administration, as they have in other areas, going ahead and countermanding the will of Congress and trying to do something by executive fiat that actually needs legislation in order to do it. So there are some, committees, like I said earlier, that have been emptied out or have been idled rather than formally terminated.
As you look at this past, and if past is prologue, what are you expecting in the future? Will this trend continue?
That's a great question. The data shows that there are sort of these periodic spikes in these committees being terminated. So we don't know if there are more that are going to be on the chopping block. The administration has created a handful of new committees. It's on a much smaller scale than previous administrations have done as far as creating new committees to deal with emerging issues. The pattern is certainly one of shrinking and generally hacking away at the administrative state and not necessarily placing a premium on expertise or experience. So it seems reasonable to think that this may continue apace.
You also mentioned that most of these panels are covered under FACA, and there's a lot of reporting requirements and transparency requirements that go along with that law, reporting on the deliberations of the panels and sharing that. What does this administration's approach to these panels and the termination of them mean for transparency and public access to this kind of information?
Yeah, you're going to lose that guarantee of public access. In one sort of tranche of these committees that have been terminated at HHS, as I mentioned before, there's a group of these HHS expert panels that review grant applications. And what our reporting told us was that the department has terminated some of these committees that had to comply with the strictures of FACA, including the transparency requirements, and sort of they didn't get rid of the grant review process, but have instead shifted that work over to these more ad hoc working groups that are reviewing them that apparently are not subject to the same transparency requirements. So that is suggestive of work that's being done in the public interest out of a place where the public can find out what's going on and into something that's more of a black box.
I've been speaking with Robert Iafolla. He's the principal legal reporter for Bloomberg Law. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing this important report.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, what's happening with the 2026 appropriations bills? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Lawmakers are racing to finalize the National Defense Authorization Act with a vote expected in early December. At the same time, 9 appropriations bills remain unresolved after the shutdown deal And the Senate is preparing for a high-stakes vote on healthcare premiums before year's end. Lauren Duggan, Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government, is here with what to expect when Congress returns after Thanksgiving. Lauren, it's great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
There's so many headlines coming out of Congress, I can't even keep track. But let's get to funding. Rumor has it that the NDAA is going to get a vote soon. What are you hearing?
That's what we're hearing as well. This has been a target to do something by the end of the year. Both chambers passed versions, sent them to informal talks where they're trying to come up with a compromise. And the big four, the chairman and ranking members of the committees, have been sitting down and hashing that out. We first need to see text. They'll come up with an agreement and post this text. We'll be poring over it and seeing what it says. And they had hoped for votes in early December once they all get back to town after Thanksgiving and get that through and on to President Trump, because it is a big bill every year. They always do it. No one wants to fail at doing it. And so we're likely to see a compromise and some votes in December on that.
Any surprising additions over the last few weeks?
Well, I think the big thing that's been introduced to the debate has been whether or not to preempt state AI regulation using language in this bill. That was something that had come up in the summer around the reconciliation or the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, where they had inserted it in the House, took it out in the Senate, and it's come back as an issue and would talk around maybe a draft executive order on AI policy or some sort of legislative language to address that. So that's been one of the things that's come up. And, the bill like that always attracts everything from contracting policy to defense questions to war and peace and things like that. So, I think the compromise that comes out will have broad support among the folks who need to vote on it. So that might mean some things drop out of the conversation, but we haven't seen, until we see that language, we won't know what makes the cut. Well,
it's good to hear that it's moving forward on that end of the year timeline. Let's move to appropriations bills. When we got the shutdown settlement, we got a small minibus of bills with full year appropriations. But now they're talking about some other combinations. What are you hearing, and what's the progress before January 30th?
Right. So the continuing resolution that reopened the government had 3 of the bills for agriculture and FDA, legislative branch, and military construction and VA. So those are all set. But there's still 9 to go. And one of the questions is, how do you package them? What do you do? And which chambers vote on things next? So what we have been anticipating is a package in the Senate that would be the Senate bills, not necessarily a compromise, but at least to move the ball forward, package together 4 or 5 bills. I think the keys to that would be defense and then the labor HHS education bills, which are kind of like your guns and butter combination, plus some other bills that have come out of the Appropriations Committee. Likewise, the appropriators, the top ones in the House and the Senate, sat down and tried to find their own path forward. What talks can we have? Do we want to wait for the Senate? So there's been some talk and some activity, but the January 30th deadline gives them a little bit of wiggle room. They may try to get something done before the end of the year, but obviously they don't have to do another thing until January 30th.
Let's talk about that first bundle you mentioned, defense, labor, and education. The Trump administration has been announcing its dismemberment of the education department, not its disestablishment, but its dismemberment. If they pass an appropriations bill that treats the department like it always was, how do you put Humpty Dumpty back together again in those circumstances?
I mean, this sort of goes back to the executive action on a lot of different things where Congress had passed. I mean, let's go back to the beginning of this year where USAID was a fully funded agency and was slowly phased out, and some of its responsibilities diffused elsewhere. So, the education department, as you mentioned, they took some steps last week, announced some, spidering out of its duties across the government as they'd like to see. Congress would probably have to pass a bill to completely disestablish the department, but we'll see what they say in these bills. I mean, they've written, to my knowledge, the education portion of that labor HHS education bill as though the department was what it was when they approved that bill. So, Congress may push back on a complete dismemberment of the department, but that's part of the kind of ongoing dynamic here that we've seen all year.
I'm speaking with Lauren Duggan. He's Deputy News Director at Bloomberg Government. Lauren, a couple other things I want to take up with you. One, discharge petitions seem to be having a moment in the House. Talk to us about why that is happening and what it means in terms of regular order.
So discharge petitions matter most when there's a really narrow majority, and there's the majority party and the majority of a day. And the majority of a day means you get 218 to sign on to one of these petitions, and you can pull forward legislation even if leaders don't want. And to your point, we've seen that a couple of times this year. We saw it on proxy voting for parents. We saw it on most recently. We saw it on the Epstein case, obviously, which was one that had dragged out for a while. And then Jared Golden, a Maine Democrat, got it on a labor-related bill, and he attracted enough Republican support. And that's what it means here. There are a lot of Democrats, but you need at least a few Republicans. They cross over. You can control the floor, or at least push your bill forward. Historically, this existed because the speaker had an iron grip on the House agenda, and members banded together and created this process. There is some talk now, some pushback. Do we need to change this process, make it harder? And we'll see if there's any traction for that. But as long as the majority is as narrow as it is, and you get enough members to band with you, you can kind of control the agenda for a brief period of time.
Well, it does at least seem to be moving some things forward.
It definitely is moving things forward. I mean, the Epstein vote had been wanted by people for a long time, and then they finally got it. And what was even more interesting there is you went from like a bare majority signing on to the discharge petition to all but one of those who voting yes in the end. So, the dynamics there are really interesting.
So there's one more topic that I want to take up with you, and it bundles several recent headlines together. We had a federal judge who ruled that Trump's deployment of the National Guard in the District of Columbia was illegal. We had some members of both houses of Congress create a video talking about why the military doesn't need to obey illegal orders, and a response from the White House on that. And then we've got Ukraine and Venezuelan operations that continue to circulate. I don't want to dig into any of those specifically, but collectively, Congress has a responsibility here when it comes to military operations and deployment. Do all of these things perhaps portend a more active engagement from either the Senate or the House on these issues of military operations?
I mean, we've seen some of that. Obviously, there's pushback a lot of times from Democrats on what this administration is doing, but there is Republican pushback as well. We've seen that on some of the foreign policy questions, whether it's tariffs or attacking Venezuela, preventing an attack on land in Venezuela, dealing with the boats. So Congress is asserting itself in some places, but, controlling the hearings right now, that's all Republicans. And if they want to avoid a hearing that would perhaps raise some of these questions. But at the same time, if you get a nominee for a defense job in front of some senators, they may ask some tough questions, and likewise in the House. So I think we'll see some discussion, some pushback on some of these things. The defense debate that we've talked about having both on the spending side and the authorization side, there could be discussion around all those topics in there as well. So, we see Congress asserting itself in different ways, and outside of Congress too, using social media channels, using the media to get their message across or try to push back on what they don't like.
So what are you anticipating will be at the top of the agenda when Congress gets back after the Thanksgiving holiday?
One thing that's going to surge back is this ACA enhanced premium tax credit issue, how to prevent increases in what people are paying for their health insurance under Obamacare. Going into the recess, there was no consensus. They're going to try to push for it. Senators agreed to vote by the end of the year on something. We'll be looking to see what that something ends up being. But that's really driving a lot of the discussion on and off the floor right now.
I'm speaking with Lauren Duggan, Deputy News Director at Bloomberg Government. Lauren, thanks as always.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. President Trump's transition into the White House earlier this year was not exactly usual. The administration departed from several norms of the presidential transition process, leaving open some big questions for the future. The Partnership for Public Service has some key takeaways from the latest presidential transition, along with recommendations for reforming the process. Federal News Network's Drew Friedman gets more from the partnership's Vice President of Government Affairs, Jenny Mattingly.
Where the partnership started in this process was, for many transitions, there wasn't a standardized process, and it was sort of ad hoc across administrations. And what would happen is that an outgoing administration and an incoming administration wouldn't necessarily work together across all of the different facets of transitioning over work. And so part of where we stepped in was seeing that there was this big need to have a little more consistency around how transitions happen. And so, fast forward today, part of this need for transition is that you've got outgoing administrations making sure they are teeing up information, whether they're political appointees or career appointees, of what's been going on the past 4 years. So then the incoming administration has some sense of what they're stepping into. And then an incoming administration also needs to rapidly start getting their team in place, getting, political appointees, transition teams. And so they typically go into agencies post-election and start learning again where agencies stand on different issues, what work has been happening, and maybe what things they might be thinking of in terms of their policy priorities of the incoming administration and how that fits into the work of the agency. And so typically there's this, and built up over the last several transitions, this changeover in one team to the next. And it's been working relatively consistently for the past several cycles.
So zooming in more specifically on what we saw in the 2024 transition, can you give us a refresher about how things kind of went in this most recent one, and then possibly where things departed from some of those norms?
You've touched on something that is out there right now as sort of a foreshadowing, if you will, in this transition, is the idea of norms, and how many things that we do in government were built up around norms and sort of just ways of doing business that weren't actually statutory. So stepping back to the first part of this, is we did see the incoming team and the outgoing team, they were prepared. They did have transition teams early. They were aware of timelines. This cycle was a little different because on the Democratic side, you had presidential candidates switch during the transition. So the typical, usually, precedent has been recently, best practice is to start your transition and thinking about it early, and quite early, even before the election, because you're stepping in to run massive organizations that you want to make sure you're prepared for, and they have very significant national security, economic, health, roles in this country. And so, but because of the switch in candidates, that transition planning didn't get off to the same quick start, although it did happen, and they were prepared for it. So that was one change from this year. I think another thing that we saw is that last couple cycles, but particularly this one, transition teams haven't been wanting to use the services that agencies provide to them. Typically, the General Services Administration, GSA, provides IT support, office space, other transition support. And most campaigns, and particularly this time, have not been using that support from GSA in the same way. And so we're seeing sort of this norm and expectation of candidates wanting to take support given to them, which also comes with transparency, things about the money you're raising, who's working on the transition. Those are baked into accepting that support. And that's just not happening as much. And this time around, it really didn't happen to the same level. And so we're certainly seeing a changeover in those particular types of processes.
What do you really make of the fact that they're not taking advantage of those resources? I mean, is that a reflection on the transition teams themselves, or is that saying, hey, there's a need for bigger types of reforms or changes for future transitions?
Our takeaway from that is really that while the Presidential Transition Act, which is the statutory vehicle that governs transition, while that set a good foundation for the modern transition, it needs to be updated. Just like everything, as things evolve, it needs to be updated. And so I think what we're seeing is that, government IT is not always seen as the, most effective use for candidates. And so they want to bring in their own IT systems. They want to have their own, email servers, things like that. And so I think we've got to find a way to acknowledge that what campaigns and candidates want now may not be what they wanted in the past, but we still need to figure out how to make sure those systems are secure, how to make sure we're having privacy protections on PII, other things. And so I think these are spaces where we've said, look, there needs to be some updating again to the Presidential Transition Act, and that probably is going to be a statutory fix that'll be required.
Can you tell me maybe a little bit more specifically what are some of the recommendations or things that you, as the partnership, are trying to suggest for reforms here?
Yeah, one of the big things, and I mentioned this just briefly prior, is that when a campaign accepts transition services from GSA, then it triggers reporting requirements and also limits on how much money you can fundraise for a transition. I think people don't, realize that candidates do raise money to pay for some of their own transition work. And so by not accepting those services, all of a sudden those transparency mechanisms don't happen. And so one of the biggest things is to actually break apart or separate the accepting of services from the transparency and ethics requirements, and really making sure that those transparency requirements, the ethics requirements, the security clearance requirements for folks coming into government are adhered to, and they aren't predicated on the use of any sort of accepted services from GSA.
That definitely came up with the Trump administration's transition team in this most recent round of things. They failed, for example, to sign the MOU with GSA, and they had some delays with background checks, I believe. I'm curious from your perspective and what you've seen since then, do you see any consistencies or continuation of, those sorts of actions in the administration as it came in this year?
These were norms, like we said. Yes, they were predicated on signing MOUs, and some of those are baked into statute. But I think the assumption had been, of course, a candidate would want to, follow some of these guidelines around security clearance and finding their nominees and for positions, bringing in transition teams. And we didn't see that as much play out during this transition, like you said. And I think during the course of the last 10, 11 months, we've also seen some of the things that we thought were norms and the ways of doing business. We've seen that not play out, and that this administration hasn't necessarily followed those norms in the same way. And so I think that's a conversation that a lot of folks are having right now, is how do you ensure guardrails around transparency, ethics, security, whether it's transition or whether it's in the way agencies function and the way Congress and agencies work together. I think that's a big question, and we saw it play out initially in the transition period.
Is there anything that you are taking away from this most recent cycle that you might incorporate the next time we kind of come back to the table here? Anything that you're going to look at differently or through a different lens now?
Really, the couple of things we've talked about is, I think, the signals from campaigns about, again, these services and whether they really want to go their own way or use the services by GSA. I think we've seen it through 1-2 cycles really at this point of transition. So some of these things, the question is still, is this the new norm, or is it just a feature of these particular transitions? And so we'll be watching to see which of these things that we've seen play out this year and somewhat in the last 2 cycles, whether they are becoming sort of the new way of doing business going forward.
Jenny Mattingly is Vice President of Government Affairs at the Partnership for Public Service, speaking there with Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. You can find Drew's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.